Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your first flip of me being back, like, stateside after going to Italy and whatnot. Again, I wanted to go over a quick shout out. Really enjoyed class with y'all today. It was so cool watching a lot of y'all remember stuff that the fantastic Mr. Wooderson has taught you and things like that. I love the fact that we thought we knew what the Treaty of Tortillas or the Treaty of Tordesillas and all that stuff is. But going into it, right, understanding where we're going now, I love that y'all have some prior knowledge. I love that you understand what's going on. I love hearing Delilah go like, I like this unit. All right, there we go. That's a good thing to key off on. Remember, the more you try to enjoy the class, the more you try to enjoy the content, the better off your experience will be, okay? Now, the big thing about it, though, diving head first back into it, we talked a lot about how the Dutch are going to start setting up shop over in the Moluccas Islands / the Spice Islands, and we talked about Java being a big one of those. And we'll come back around that to that later when we start talking about the rise of these companies following the commercial revolution, the East India companies, and stuff like that, right? But diving right back into, I've said diving a lot just now, but getting back into where we left off in class, we're talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas and the line that Alexander the Sixth, the Pope, actually drew, which is going to look like this when it actually gets drawn. So we're actually looking right there. That dotted line right there is the line done by Alexander the Sixth. Later on, the Treaty of Tordesillas official line would be this darker purple one right there from 1494, and it's going to establish the Portuguese side on this side and the Spanish side on this side. Now, even later on, like 30 years later, the Treaty of Saragossa is going to go over here, and it's actually going to be very important when we start talking about it because Spain's going to colonize the Philippines, and it's why actually a lot of the Philippines can speak Spanish, and so but they had to redraw this line to kind of try and keep Spanish interests out of this general area right there. But the big thing about it though is it just kind of dramatically split the line, and when y'all started talking about this with Mr. Wooderson and Don Pedro and how he came over and actually conquested and created the colony of Brazil, right, Rowan? Good job. This area right there, when that happened, that's actually done because the original line cut the tip of Brazil off, allowing the Portuguese to settle here and then expand outward towards the Amazon rainforest, right? So you can't draw lines perfectly all the time when you only have an astrolabe and a compass, so, things like that are going to happen. Now, another big couple of things we're going to talk about in this flip going forward is we're going to talk about Magellan, okay, and then we're also going to talk about early French and English exploration. Because to sit there and be like, oh yeah, the Spanish are going to be the only people in the North and South America is stupid, right? Like, to sit there and think that, this line on a map is going to prevent everything from going down is kind of silly, right? Now, one of the weird ones is the French ones, just because, they're also Catholics, so how'd they pull this off, and why didn't the Pope stop them? But a lot of it had to do with how to keep Portugal and Spain, which actually border one another, from fighting each other, right? So getting into it, though, the very first guy we're going to talk about is a Portuguese man by the name of Magellan. Go ahead and jot this down. The big reason why Magellan is so famous and why that sports brand is so famous and all the fishing equipment that apparently Gianna Rodriguez's dad does not wear. The big thing about it in general is that Magellan is the very first man to try and do one very important thing. He's the very first man to try and do what's called circumnavigate the planet, right? Okay, so what happened is that Magellan tried to take a voyage around the entire planet in one vessel, right? He took a small cadre of ships, not a cadre, but he took a small number of ships to start the exploration. It would eventually just be one left, and he tried to go all the way around the planet, right? So jumping back over to this line of demarcation map, when you see or look at this, basically what happened is he started right here in Portugal, and he came over to the Portuguese areas around the coast of Africa, bounced over to South America, and kept trying to come all the way around this region, right? And he came through this area, which is known as Cape Horn, okay? Make sure you say that right. Cape Horn at the bottom of South America, and he actually almost his ship almost went down. He almost died due to several storms that were going on there. And when he actually came out the other side, he said that the waters in this region of the world were actually so much more calm and peaceful than that of this area right here below South America. And so he named this area the Pacific Ocean for its peaceful waters, right? Pacify, or as in to be peaceful, right? Thank you very much, Magellan, for doing that. And then he continued on in this direction where he wrapped around the planet, and then he started coming over here, and he started bouncing around, and he ended up actually in the Philippines, where he then tried to convert the natives to Christianity, and then he died because they actually cut his head off and killed him. And then his voyage, though, ended up coming all the way around, and one of the only people that actually did the entire circumnavigation of the planet in Magellan's voyage, we actually believed was a man from Africa, right? We believe that one of the only people that survived the voyage was an African slave, and he might have actually steered the boat back into harbor in Portugal. And the thing about it is we give Magellan credit for doing this, even though he didn't make it the whole way around, right? So, it's a very interesting point to point out because it's always very important to know that a lot of non-Europeans were involved in European history, and actually a lot of them didn't get credit. So now the big thing getting into it as well, Magellan is going to be the very first one to do that, right? And so, he's going to actually, well, not really, as we just said, But getting into it as well, we also need to talk about some of the earlier settlements, right? When we're talking about some of these other early settlements of England and France, they are going to try to get involved and they're going to try to create and establish settlements on their own, right? They're going to show up from the 1490s to the 1570s after Columbus kind of like falls around in the Caribbean and stuff like that. And these early explorations didn't go so hot, all right? So particularly because the English are going to realize that the climate is going to be really, really hellacious and they're not going to be able to survive the whole thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we get to some of the other colonies. But the big ones that went out there and really tried to discover some stuff with at the agreement of the Pope and things like that, the French, right? The French went around and bounced around different areas of Nova Scotia, different areas of Canada, and they found an excessive, plentiful amount of two resources, right? So go ahead and jot this down. Frenchmen and French explorers are going to begin to start discovering plentiful fur resources and things like muskrats and these guys right here, beavers, right? And fur trapping is going to be a big thing. They're known as French journeymen, right? And it's a big reason why the area of Quebec is going to actually speak French to this day, because some of the earliest settlements and fur trapping locations were actually started in northern Canada in that general region during the early 1500s. They also discovered an expansive amount of codfish above, like in the northern sector of the Atlantic near North America. And codfish is a very plentiful fish. They're very, very large. And there were huge, huge schools of them. So French and English sailors began to go over there and fish and bring a lot of that stuff back to Europe. Actually, it's the big reason why Portugal, their national dish is actually known as salted cod, because of the massive influx of cod coming in from North America, right? So now going forward, though, so we talked about the Spice Islands, talked about all this other stuff going on in the background, but now we got to get into Spanish conquest, right? We got to start talking about how the Spaniards are not going to be content with only having the Caribbean islands. So right now, let's take a second, right? This is where we get into that jumping around on our timeline, and I want to make sure that people like, Sophie Panzavecchia and Delilah and Stella Merrill, right? All of us know what we're doing right now, okay? So when we're looking at this entire thing, something we need to be very, very aware of is that those early, French explorers going off over there and finding beaver furs and codfish and stuff like that is all happening around the same time that the Spaniards are now going to start going off into Central and South America and start trying to take some stuff over, right? Because we remember back to the jewelry, right? Remember back to the jewelry with Columbus and how he is going to create a very large thirst for gold amongst the Spaniards, right? Now, the most well-known figure that tried to go out into mainland North America, mostly Mexico and Belize, and try to take over that entire area in the name of the Spanish is a man by the name of Hernando Cortez, right? And I believe his expedition started in 1519, but while I'm talking, I'll go ahead and look that up as well, just to make sure that we know when this happened. So, Hernan Cortez, Cortez, Conquest of Mexico. All right, there we go. Tell me I'm right. 1521. I was 2 years off. All right, so now anyway. So the big thing about it, though, 1521 and 1519 is the beginning of the Spanish conquest period, right? So Hernan Cortez is going to go out there following Columbus's image, and he's like, I heard from the people in the Caribbean that there's a lot of gold over there, right? Well, the thing about it, we have to also know and understand how big his force is and who he's going to take over, right? And so Hernan Cortez in 1521 sets off with 600 men, 16 horses, 10 cannons, and a handful of boats, right? And he wants to go out and he wants to try and take over this thing known as the Mexica Empire, right? Now, really quickly, you don't know them as the Mexica, right? But the Mexica is what we use to call a very, very large empire of people that you probably heard of before when you were in elementary school, right? You might have heard of them as the Aztecs, right? So the thing about it is, though, is we refer to the Aztec Empire as the Mexican Empire now because the Aztecs actually took over so much land. So the thing about it that we need to understand going into this flip is it's going to be one of those moments where Mr. Terry is going to probably tell you things that aren't going to pop up on an AP test, but he's telling you because it's very important to acknowledge the people that were living in these areas before the Spaniards showed up, right? It's important to know that because it's important because they oftentimes get written off in history, right? Much like Africans who got literally stolen into the slave trade. We've gotten written off in history as the African slave that probably piloted Magellan's voyage back into harbor and might be the one man that actually did go around the world first. It's important to understand that these people that don't get tons of credit throughout history deserve their credit as well, right? So getting into it, though, as well, you have to understand Hernan Cortez is going to sail off to try and take over an empires of people with a very small force, right? We're looking at this, like, look at it, like, how big his expedition is. 600 men, 16 horses, and 10 cannons. Another really important fact as well is he wasn't even supposed to go, right? So, like, it was a job given to somebody else, right? Hernando Cortez actually got passed over by the mayor of Cuba to go out there and actually, like, try and discover gold in the area of the Aztec Empire and then also try to create some dealings and trade negotiations with them. And Hernan Cortez got passed over by another man. And like another guy was given the job, and Hernan Cortez was really furious and upset about it. And the day of the expedition to launch came, and the man that actually was supposed to go showed up dead, right? I know. All right, so like the big thing about it though is that man showed up dead and Cortez was gone and it sailed off with those different items, right? And he went over there with 3 ships, and when he landed on the shores of Mexico, he set those boats on fire. And he knew for a fact if he went back to Cuba without creating a very large conquest, he might be arrested, right? So he actually burned his ships in the harbor and said, we aren't leaving without enough money to show off to the Spanish government, right? So they head out there to try and take over the Mexica Empire, right? Now, when they get there, you have to understand a lot of this other crazy stuff is going to start. Like, for example, he's actually going to meet a priest, a drunk Catholic priest that is actually going to be living in Belize who knows how to speak Mayan, okay? So it's a very weird thing about it. We'll talk about the lost in translation perspective here in a minute. But the big thing about it going forward is that he actually had to speak through 2 different people to figure out all this stuff. But the thing that we need to understand right now is that the Aztecs were a very sophisticated empire. The biggest thing you need to remember is that y'all know how Miss Urso loves Rome, right? Loves Latin and loves the history of Rome, right? And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to watch her get really, really excited about that stuff, right? So the interesting point about it is the Aztecs are like the Romans of the world, like of North America, right? They had a massive empire. This, for example, right here was their capital city, known as Tenochtitlan, that had a population of over 1 million people in it. And this is a map of the actual city itself, built in radiating circles on top of a lake. Why, though, would you build your area on top of a lake? That seems ridiculous, right? Well, the reason why the Aztecs decided to build on top of a lake has a lot to do with a prophecy, okay? So in the earliest form of the Aztec part of history, okay, so what we're doing now is we're just talking about Aztec history a little bit, right? So in the earliest prophecies of the Aztec people, they believed that their holy men were told by the gods that they believed in that they would know where to settle their city, their massive city that would turn into an empire, when they saw an eagle standing on a cactus, eating a snake. And when they were traveling throughout the area of southern Mexico, they discovered an eagle sitting on a cactus, eating a snake that actually was out in the middle of a very large lake, right? And out in the middle of this large lake, they said, that is where we will settle our massive, massive city. But the issue is you got to figure out how to build on top of a lake, right? And also, where is that symbol of an eagle and a snake and a cactus? It's on the Mexican flag, right? It's literally on the flag of Mexico, right smack in the middle, right? Alluding to their entire like country's grand history, right? So going into it, though, they decided to build their capital on this flanking lake, right? That's ridiculous. That means that the Aztecs had to learn how to build on water. And I'm not kidding you when I tell you this, that they literally created these things called chinampas, right? Chinampas were Aztec man-made islands that they would farm on top of. That's genius, right? And what they would actually do is they would take reeds that actually grew on the banks of that lake and they would weave them into mats, right? And then they would take a reed mat and they put it right here and they'd take a layer of mud and then take a reed mat and then layer of mud. And they would make this big like reed and mud cake, right? And sit it on top of the water and it would float. And then they would plant a tree on the corners of each part of it and the tree's roots would grow down into the bottom of the lake and would solidify it and anchor it into place. And they literally farmed on man-made islands called chinampas, Chinampas. That is ridiculous. They are a very sophisticated group of people that actually like farm things like beans and squash and corn, or like early forms of corn and things like that. And they had a very sophisticated society as well that had basically like an Aztec version of feudalism in it. Like they had like higher class nobles and rulers and different forms of like different higher echelon classes within their societies. And another amazing thing about them as well is look at their art, their headdresses, but most importantly, their weapons, right? Their weapons gave the Aztecs the ability to go out and take over most of the Mexica, like the area that you would call today modern-day Mexico, right? And they did so with spears like that and swords like these, right? So they actually walked out there with swords made of obsidian glass, which is a volcanic type of rock that is like black in its essence and can be sharpened up into razor sharp edges. And they would embed it inside of wooden handles, and they would use this to take over huge swaths of area, right? Lava rocks made into swords is what the Aztecs knew how to use, and the Spanish have written them off for hundreds of years as being like, oh, a primitive bunch of heathens. I disagree, sirs, all right? So, like, they actually were so sophisticated and were able to go out there and do all of this that they took over everything right here in yellow, right? Using that weaponry, using this to go out there and do this. And some of y'all are probably sitting there thinking, you're like, well, Mr. Terry, pump the brakes. Then how are the Spanish going to be able to take over such a large, sophisticated area? And when I say sophisticated, they're so sophisticated that they had literally people in Tenochtitlan that had the job to sweep the streets and keep it clean, right? Like, so how are the Spanish going to do this? It's because the Aztecs lacked two particular things that the Spanish had, right? One, forgeable metal, right? If you swing an obsidian sword into an iron one, the iron one's going to win every time, okay? Also, they didn't have gunpowder-based weapons like the Spaniards had. The Spaniards had cannons and guns and horses. Well, horses aren't powered by gunpowder, but you know what I'm saying. They had like large, sophisticated weapons that they were able to use against them. And then also, another big thing is Aztecs lacked large domesticated animals, right? Big animals like cows and pigs and things like that, and horses, and that's going to prevent the Aztecs from being exposed to things like smallpox or measles or influenza, which are illnesses that come originally from actually herding and domesticating animals. So when the Spanish showed up, they were all, like, very, very affected by those big three diseases, right? That Avery knew when we were talking about class today, right? She's like, measles, right? And got it exactly right the entire time. And then also, though, another big thing that you need to understand about this, though, is the Spanish are going to use this to their advantage. They're going to do one of the dirtiest moves in all of history. And the Spanish are going to convince the people that the Aztecs had taken over to betray them and unite against them. Because the Spanish figured something out when they landed in Mexico, right? They landed in Mexico, and they actually began to learn that the people that the Aztec had taken over hated them, right? Like, so they hated them because the Aztecs took a tax from them every single year. They would take from them young people to be sacrificed, right? And literally, the Aztecs, much like many like Mesoamerican societies, believed in human sacrifice, right? And the Aztecs on holy days would actually literally cut someone's heart out and sacrifice them to their gods, right? And this created a lot of resentment from the people that actually had taken them over, right? Like, so, or like the people towards the Aztecs, because they were like, I don't want to keep giving these people to them for them to keep cutting their hearts out and stuff. And we'll talk about it in class. We're going to sacrifice one of y'all tomorrow. It's going to be a lot of fun. And they would literally cut the hearts out of these people and stuff them into these things called jaguar jars, and they had to still be like, but we'll talk about that in class and stuff like that. But when the Aztecs were doing this, they had a culture that was so sophisticated, but almost set up in like literally easy opposition for the Spaniards to take over. Now, getting into it as well, this man right here is the leader of the Aztecs when the Spaniards under Cortez show up. And his name is Moctezuma. M-O-C-T-E-Z-U-M-A. Moctezuma, right? So Mocte or Monte, depending on how you translate it, was the king of the Aztecs and was believed to be their godlike ruler, right? Who ruled over Tenochtitlan, who ruled over the Aztec sacrifice system, ruled over their military, and did all these other things, right? And he is going to come head-to-head with Hernan Cortez, because the mission at first was supposed to just be reconnaissance, right? The big thing about it is that Hernan Cortez's mission was originally supposed to be go out there, talk to them, see how much gold they have, figure out where they're getting it from, and then we'll recollect and come back later, right? But again, remember, like we said earlier, but Cortez is going to burn those ships in the harbor because he's like, I'm not here for recon, I'm here for conquest. Because Hernan Cortez is a terrible person, and not a good person in history at that. And so going into it, though, when Hernan Cortez lands in Belize, he meets a disgraced Spanish priest who knows how to speak Spanish, which is what Cortez speaks, and knows how to speak Mayan. And then they go off and find a young girl who knows how to speak Mayan and Aztec. And so now they can speak to the Aztecs through 3 degrees of separation, right? And a very interesting thing got lost in translation. When all of a sudden, when Cortez, who had gotten lost and didn't know where to go, right? Like, so he had no idea where he was going, and he had gotten lost when he was trying to find Tenochtitlan, but they had actually, all of a sudden one day, a man came out of the jungle carrying gifts from Moctezuma. Because Moctezuma had heard they were coming, right? He's not stupid. He heard they were coming. He was like, no, send them gifts. Send them jaguar pelts and feathers and flowers and honey and gold. And maybe they'll turn around and go home if we send them these gifts, right? And the big thing about it is that they asked in this translation, right? They asked literally like their translators to speak to this man with the gifts and say, how much more of this gold is back in Tenochtitlan? And after it got lost through translation, what Cortez heard was a lot, right? And they headed towards Tenochtitlan with the sheer mission of taking it over. And Cortez abused that dissension in the Mexican Empire. Those people that didn't like the Aztecs because they had to give them over for sacrifice, literally abused it and used it to his advantage, right? And actually recruited a decent military cadre of 6,000 natives that didn't like the Aztecs to show up and walk up to Tenochtitlan and try to take it over, right? So 200 Spaniard men stayed and went with him, and then 400 stayed behind. 6,000 natives and 2 interpreters headed towards Tenochtitlan to take it over. And Montezuma, or Moctezuma, however you want to say it, doesn't really matter because you can say it both ways, welcomed the Spanish in. Now wait, this is where it gets weird. Welcomed them in and was like, welcome, we cannot wait to work with you. We cannot wait to do this peacefully. And he tried to negotiate peacefully with the Spanish at first. But Cortez, when Moctezuma refused to convert to Christianity, took him hostage, and negotiations broke down aggressively. And the Aztecs turned on their leader and attacked him. What actually happened is Cortez took Moctezuma as a hostage and then marched him out in front of those huge temples in Tenochtitlan and told him to tell his people to listen to what the Spanish said, give over their gold, and listen and convert to Christianity. And then the people at the ground level looked up at Moctezuma and they were like, our leader, our God leader would never say this. And they apparently started hucking rocks at him and killed Moctezuma. So Moctezuma was actually killed by his own people because they bludgeoned him to death with rocks. Now keep in mind though, 6,000 natives, 200 Spanish people, you would think are going to be so many people that would be easily to take over Tenochtitlan. But remember, Tenochtitlan had over 1 million people in it, right? And so the Aztecs are going to collect together, get their weapons, and drive those 6,000 natives and those 200 Spanish out of the city. But unfortunately, even though Cortez was driven out, they returned and smallpox had been decimating the city of Tenochtitlan, right? Cortez survived, ran away, recruited the rest of the remaining Spanish. Smallpox destroyed a heavy number of the Aztec people, and they walked in and took over the city with little resistance on the second voyage, right? And you're going to see the destruction of so many Aztec artifacts because they're not Christian, right? Because they're going to go in there and begin to set and take over the entire Mexico area and claim it in the name of Spain and claim it in the name of their God and claim it in the name of economic gain. And that was those big 3, right? Gold, God, and glory, right? And Cortez's story is a very, very big, important essence to this entire thing. And his cousin is going to do something really, really similar down in Peru, right? But we'll talk about him when we get into class. But his cousin, Francisco Pizarro, is going to do this to the Incas as well. And I can't wait to see what y'all remember from Mr. Wooderson's class tomorrow when we start talking about the ancient Inca in Peru, okay? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.